Bonsuelo yet again. What are we going to do? We're going to continue with functions. Now, what did we do last time? We defined what's domain, what's range, what's the function. I showed you function notation, okay? I showed you how to look at something when I say, like, find the f of 3. What's the value of y when x is 3? Okay? Now, I also showed you how to find the domain and range of x, y points, because they're kind of easy to explain. What do I mean by domain and range? What do I mean by a function? On this video, I'm going to talk about domain and range of graphs. And on the next one, oh, happy day, yes, there's another one, I'm going to tell you how to tell if a graph is a function or not. Okay, so first of all, I kind of wish you could see me, because there'd be something I would show to you. So hopefully we're back in class, and I will show it to you if we are. But what I'm going to recommend you do to find domain of a graph is this. Okay, pass a vertical line, and actually take a vertical line. Now, you're all holding a vertical line in your hand. It's called a pencil. Okay, take that pencil straight up and down. Okay, pass a vertical line. Actually pass your pencil. I don't know why people don't like doing this, but actually use your pencil and do this. Through the graph from left to right. Put your pencil vertically on the left-hand side of the screen, and then slowly pass it to the right. So I'm going to draw some lines on here. This is kind of what I'm saying for you to do. Put your pencil over here, then move it 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 here. It's going to take me forever to erase this garbage. Then move it here, then move it here. Just keep moving it left and right, okay? Hey, that wasn't that bad. And then what you want to do is tell me what's the first value for x, what's the last value for x. See, when you looked at the xy points, there were just, you could list the xy points very easily. You could list the x's easily, you could list the y. There were only, a handful of x's or a handful of y's. Here, how many points are on any graph? Okay, I'm going to draw something. Again, you don't need to draw any of this yet. Like from here to here, how many points are on that? Well, it's an infinite number. You can't possibly list them all, okay? Like this first example, how many points are on that graph? Well, there's an infinite number of points on that graph. There is no way you could possibly list them all, okay? So what you're going to do is use interval notation, or you could write an inequality, but it's easier to use interval notation. And you're going to tell me what's the first, just an interval. What's the first value for x? What's the last value for x? Okay, and it's got to be smallest to largest. That's why you have to go from left to right. Okay, it's easier to write an interval, but you should be able to write either the interval or an inequality. I can ask you for either one, but I'm just telling you, the interval's way easier. Okay, so let's take a look at this. What happens? I'm going to draw a dashed line. And you don't need to draw all this stuff, but okay. You put your pencil there, still not touching the graph, still not touching the graph. Once you hit here, you're touching the graph. Well, what's the x coordinate for that point? And I think this is why it's important to actually use your pencil. It's easy to confuse the x and y coordinates here. So if you notice, this dashed line, which is where your pencil would be, has an x coordinate of -4. Okay, so your domain, the first value is -4. Okay, fine, then you keep passing the pencil through it. And then eventually you hit here, the last one, and it's got a x value of -1. These are both x values. They're not both y values. And at this point, I should kind of tell you something. Okay? And it has to do with notation. Okay. What does this mean? I'm just making this up. It's not this, it's not this problem. okay? Well, it can actually mean two things. It can, and most likely you would have it mean the point 5 comma 20. That's fine, it may mean that. Okay, but it could also mean this, the interval from 5 to 20. And those parentheses would mean not including the 5 and not including the 20. Now, of course, if I put this, that can only be the interval because you don't use the brackets for a point, starting at 5 and ending at 20. If I put this, that would have to be a point because remember, an interval always has to be smallest to largest, and 20 is not larger than 5. 20 is larger than 5, therefore it's not smaller. But I just want to get across the point that that could mean two different things. So how do you know which one? Well, it's just context of what you're being asked, what you're discussing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, if we're talking about points, that means the point 5 comma 20. If we're talking about writing an interval, that means 5 to 20. But this is the other thing I want you to get across. Let's say it is a point. This is X, and this is Y. Okay, fine, that's if it's a point. But what if it's an interval? Well, if it's an interval for the domain, this is X, and that's also X. In other words, this is the smallest X, and this is the largest X. Okay? If it's a point, if we're referring to points, the first one's X, the second one's Y. If we're referring to an interval, it represents the same variable. And if it's domain, that same variable is X. What if we were talking about range, which we'll get to in a second? Then they would both be Y's, the smallest Y to the largest Y. So you have to be very careful with notation. Notation may seem kind of unimportant, but it's just knowing how to speak the language. And if I'm putting some stuff and you don't understand the language, it's going to be very difficult to understand. If you're trying to express an answer to me and you don't know how to speak the language of math, it's going to be very difficult. Okay, so again, you didn't need to write that down. I just wanted to point that out to you. Okay, so in this case, the x's go from an x value of -4 to an x value of -1. That's why the domain for this is -4 to -1. It means it includes every single x value starting at -4 and including -4 and going to -1 and including -1. Okay, that's the domain. Well, what do you do with the range? Now, here's where you got to be careful. You're going to use a horizontal line, right? In other words, in this direction. But don't go from top to bottom. That's what a lot of people do, because top to bottom would be largest to smallest. Remember, it's always got to be smallest to largest. So you're going to start at the bottom and start moving your pencil across and stop or start, your range wherever like this one, wherever it first touches the graph, and end it wherever it last touches the graph. So in this case, okay, the smallest y value is -2, and the largest y value is 6. So your domain, all your y values are from -2 to 6. There are no y values smaller than -2. There are no y values bigger than 6. Okay? Now, again, you might have to, pause the video and listen to that a few times, but I do want to mention something. I'm going to get rid of this because I've already written it for you. I do want to mention something. I've said you should be able to do this as an interval and as an inequality. Okay, well, how would you write these as an inequality? Well, domain is x, so you would say x is between -4 and -1. And y is from -2 to 6. Okay? Now, I'm going to And that's all you really need to have written down. I'm going to start saying some other stuff, though, and scribbling on the side of the graph. Don't write this part down. What if, though, this wasn't a dot but an open circle? Well, your domain would still be -4 to -1, but it would include the -4, but not include the -1. And your inequality, and again, you don't need both of them, you just need one or the other, would look like this. You would not have an equal sign on the inequality that's on the right-hand side. What would your range be? Again, it would still be -2 to 6. Okay? But it would still include -2, but not include the 6. Or your inequality would look like this. So I just want to point that out, and that's not there. That's why I kind of don't want you to write this down. It's still the same idea, you just wouldn't include it. And again, I'm just real briefly going to mention, what if that had an open circle also? Well, this part would be a parentheses. There'd be no equals there. There'd be no equals there. And this part would be parentheses, and the equals underneath it would be gone too. Okay? So that's basically it. And I'm telling you, use your pencil. I don't know why people don't want to do it. I'm going to get rid of this extra stuff I put here, by the way, because that's not what it was originally. I don't know why people don't like to actually move their pencil across the graph, but I'm telling you, it'll make it like almost painfully obvious if you do that. And sometimes it can be quite difficult. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. Okay, find the domain and range. And I'm going to kind of scribble as if you were moving your pencil. Okay, let's say your pencil's out here. Is the graph touching your pencil? Yes, it is, because remember, these arrows mean that the graph extends forever. So yes, it's touching the graph. Okay, well, where's the first place off to the right that it's not touching the graph? Not off to the right, sorry. Where's the first place off to the left that it's not touching the graph? There's nowhere. It's always touching the graph off on the left. So our domain would be -infinity. Remember, you never have parentheses for infinity. And then if we keep moving it across, we're still touching it, still touching it, still touching it, still touching it, still touching it. And it keeps extending to the right infinitely. Okay? As a, well, I'll put that at the end, what you'd write if you used a inequality. Okay? All right, how about range? Remember, start at the bottom. Is that graph touching that line? Yes, because remember, these extend down. Okay, so they start at -infinity. Still touching it, still touching it, still touching it, still touching it, not touching it anymore. So what does it do? It goes up to +2, and including +2, because there is a point at, y value of +2. Okay, now, if we looked at the, let me get rid of this so you can kind of see that. Okay. So again, take your pencil and move it across. And again, what I suggest you do is pause the video, try it on your own, and I'm going to say that, you should do that for everything pretty much. Okay, well, what would these look like if you had inequalities? First of all, there's no inequality. It would just be all real numbers for the domain. And the range would be y is less than or equal to 2. Okay? And I didn't specify an interval or an inequality. Either one would be acceptable here. Like I say, just the intervals are easier. Okay, let's look at the next one. Okay, Let's start on here on the left. Okay, the graph's not touching it, not touching it, not touching it. Finally here, we're touching it. So at, what's that, -3, including -3. Okay, and then it just keeps touching it forever, so to positive infinity. As an inequality, we'd say x is greater than or equal to -3. Okay? Let me get rid of these. Okay, so let's go for the range. Again, you're going to start on the bottom and go up. Not touching it, not. Okay, right there, finally, we're touching it. Okay, so what's that at? That's at 0, including 0. And then still touching it because this graph is going up, so it goes to positive infinity. Or we'd say y is greater than or equal to 0. Okay? And again, if you have a question, ask me. Okay, how about this next one? A little more complicated. Again, this is a piecewise function. It's one function. Okay? So what's happening? Are we touching it? No. Are we touching it? No. Are we touching it now? Yes. Okay? So that's at what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we're starting at -7. Okay, still touching it, still touching it. Okay, at this point we stop. That's the last one that touches it for now. And that's at what? -1. And then we take the union of that with, where do we start touching it again? Right here, which is at 2. And then it just keeps going to the right. Again, why do we need two things here? Because there's a break in the graph. By the way, at this point, when I'm done with this one, I'm going to explain some stuff to you. Okay, the domain here in terms of an inequality would be x is between -7 and -1, or you could use that union symbol, x is greater than or equal to 2. So, I think a interval is much easier. Okay, let me get rid of this stuff. And let's take a look at the range. Is it touching it? No. Touching it? No. Touching it? Yes. The first place that it touches it is at -2. Okay, touching it? Yes. Touching it? Yes. Touching it? Yes. Even though over here on the left-hand side it's not touching it, remember, it's not touching it any longer. Remember, this is one graph. And on the right-hand side, we have this arrow that goes up. So it's still touching the graph, still touching the graph, still touching the graph. It just keeps going up forever. So that's to positive infinity. Or we'd say y is greater than or equal to -2. That one's a little tougher. Again, I think if you take your pencil and move it actually across the graph, it makes it easier to see. Okay? So, I could give you all sorts of examples. Just something, I'm just going to talk for a little bit. I don't think you need to draw any of this. But notice how here there was a break in this last problem. There was a break in the domain, but there was not, we've got one interval union another interval, but that didn't happen with the range. I can draw all sorts of things, okay? I'm just going to make a quick sketch and show you something. What if I have something that looks like this? But notice, it's got to be a function. I can never touch it more than once. Well, we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, what if we have this? This stops. And then right here, this goes down like that. Okay, if you take your pencil and pass this across, okay, right there, it's touching it because the arrow's touching it, it's touching it, it's touching it, it's touching it there. Ah, I blew something. This is not a function. I blew it, sorry. That should have been an open circle. Because notice what I had drawn there, this thing, is not a function. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Because for this value of x, you'd have two values of y. I'm getting a little bit ahead of it. That's actually in the next video. But anyway, I'll just redraw it and then we'll be okay. Okay, still touching it, still touching it, still touching it. All right. Now, notice on the range though, okay, let me see if I can get rid of these lines without erasing the whole graph. Okay, notice on the range, I'm touching it down there. So if we were looking at this one, the domain would have been negative infinity to positive infinity. I'm touching it. Okay, here though, I'm not touching the graph. There's a break in it. So in the last example, the one that's up here that's actually drawn for you on the original paper, there was a break in the domain, but there's no break in the range. In this case, this thing would have no break in the domain, but there'd be a break in the range, because notice there's a place that it doesn't touch it, and then it starts touching it again. Okay? If I drew something like this, though, just to give you an idea, I wouldn't try and like memorize everything that can possibly happen. That would be pointless. Okay? You just got to move your pencil across it left to right and then up, then not up to down, but down to up. What if we have this? Okay, if you pass your pencil along this, okay, we're touching it all along here, still touching it. There's no break in the domain. There's a break in the graph, but no break in the domain. Okay, well, how about the range? There's no break in the range either. See, the arrow's going down, it's touching it, still touching it, still touching it. There was never a place that it wasn't touching it. So just because there's a break in the graph doesn't mean there's a break in the domain or the range. And I could draw you a third thing where there's a break both in the domain and the range. What if I gave you this? Okay. Not touching it, not touching it, touching it, not touching it. So this would be even more complicated. And going the other way, not touching it, not touching it, not touching. I mean, so this last one would have a break in both the domain and the range. Again, I'm not trying to say you should memorize these patterns or anything like that. That'd be totally pointless, because no matter how many you memorized, I could always think of something different. But what I'm trying to get across is you just have to take your pencil, hold it straight up and down, and move across the graph left to right. Okay? That's for the domain. And then for the range, take your pencil, hold it horizontally from the bottom, not from the top, but from the bottom, and go up. And just where's it touching the graph? All right? Hopefully that helps you. If you have a question, again, this is not necessarily easy stuff. Okay? So if you have a question, please ask me. I hope you have a great day. I hope this has fulfilled your wildest dreams. Have a good day, everybody.